So in this prompt, we're asked to compare the challenges of George Washington's presidency with the three presidents listed below. We've got James Madison, Abraham Lincoln, and Woodrow Wilson. So what this means, again, we're going to have an essay prompt that has four main points to it because you're comparing three presidents with Washington's presidency, which means you need to be very aware of Washington's presidency just as much as you're aware of Madison's, Lincoln's, and Wilson's. Now, the way that I've broken this prompt apart is actually to establish basically one main central conflict for each of the presidents with a little bit of evidence attached to each of those. So this is a fairly easy prompt to manage. You basically need to understand that Washington is, most of his conflict is going to be dealing with the origin of the country. Madison is dealing with the War of 1812. Lincoln is dealing with the Civil War. And Wilson is dealing with World War I. So let's look at these in a little bit more detail. Let's start with George Washington. Like I said, George Washington's primary conflict was dealing with the organization of the early government. So things that he dealt with would include establishing the three branches of government. The Constitution of the United States, which was signed in 1789, establishes the precedent that there should be three branches of government. But even after the Constitution is written and signed into law, we still have to work out quite a few of the details on how the three branches are going to work together. And another of the major conflicts that Washington has to deal with, primarily because of his issues with establishing the three branches of government, is that they have to handle this massive debt which they've incurred from the American Revolution. Alexander Hamilton is chosen to be a part of Washington's first cabinet. Washington very famously chose people who had opposite views to serve on his presidential cabinet because he wanted to not just hear one perspective. He wanted to hear a variety of perspectives. Alexander Hamilton serves as his Secretary of Treasury, and he gives a strong federalist view. He gives a strong national view. He wants a strong federal government. As a result, under Hamilton's leadership as Secretary of Treasury, they establish a national bank. They begin to tax and introduce new taxes, which leads to some rather negative responses. In fact, one of the more famous ones was the Whiskey Rebellion, in which Washington had to quell a rebellion, a riot inside of an early history of the United States, where farmers were rising up saying that the tax on whiskey was unfair and was unfounded. Washington has to send in 13,000 federal troops in order to quell this rebellion, in which he's trying to preserve the Union at this point. So let's move on to Madison. Madison's primary conflict that he has to deal with is the War of 1812. Now, it's not the only conflict that he has to deal with. It was probably the one that he's most famously associated with. Now, this is a conflict with Britain. Now, remember, we were fighting with Britain in 1776 up through 1781, and we signed a peace treaty with Britain in 1783 for the Revolutionary War. We're back to fighting with them in 1812 under Madison's presidency. There were territorial disputes because Britain never really left the continent. They were still very present, particularly in Canada and the northern area of what we would consider to be the United States today. There was also concern over the British practice of impressment, which was seizing American sailors at sea and forcing them to become part of the British Navy. The War of 1812 was Madison's attempt to bring peace to the United States with the enemy of Great Britain, which was still very, very scary to the early United States. At the end of this war, essentially we are able to come to peace with Britain, and everything, all territorial disputes, basically go back to where they had started. There isn't any real movement of land. And even in the peace treaty, Madison isn't able to get any mention of the British to stop using the practice of impressment. In the Civil War with Abraham Lincoln, the primary conflict for Abraham Lincoln was the preservation of the Union. This was a conflict between the northern states and the southern states, as the southern states actually seceded from the Union and formed what became known as the Confederate States of America. It is probably best described as a fight over states' rights, although it is even better described as a fight over the issue of slavery. And you can define it in both of those ways accurately. The southern states did not want the federal government to tell them they could not practice slavery inside of their states. So you could say it's a states' rights issue, but really it was a question over the eradication or the removal of slavery from the United States. And Lincoln's primary conflict was associated with the preservation of the Union. He never looked at the Confederate States of America as a legitimate country. He looked at them as states that were in rebellion with the United States. Now, Woodrow Wilson had a very different conflict. Just like Madison had the conflict with an outside party, Wilson definitely had a conflict with the outside party, and that was in World War I. What makes Wilson unique is that it really wasn't our fight. It was a fight that we got drawn into. But at the beginning, Wilson was set on maintaining neutrality. World War I was going on primarily between this time Germany and France and Britain and Italy at this time was on the side of Germany, and Austria-Hungary also on this side with Germany. And France and Britain and Russia were fighting against these Axis powers. And the United States gets pulled into this war. It's on a completely different continent. It's a whole ocean away from us. We get drawn into this war because Germany just continues to act in an aggressive manner towards us. And eventually, as a result of the Germans continuing their unrestricted submarine warfare in the Atlantic Ocean, that has an impact on the United States. And we also see Germany beginning to negotiate with Mexico, as we uncovered in what was known as the Zimmermann Telegram. We see Germany getting ready to actually launch an attack against the United States. The United States can't ignore it anymore. We realize we have to get involved in this fight, and it would be better for us to get involved in this fight on another continent before it's actually drawn to us. And so we step in support of our European allies, step in first to aid the French, and are able to help in turning the tide of the conflict in World War I. All right, so that's it for the four presidents. As you can see, Washington was primarily internal conflict. Madison was fighting on his home turf. As the British invaded the United States, they actually famously burned the White House in the War of 1812. Lincoln also was on his home turf, also an attempt to preserve the Union. Wilson is slightly different. His conflict is a ways away, and there was attempts to actually stay out of this conflict for a very long time. But we do eventually get involved and step into that conflict as it takes place in Europe. So that's it for the challenges that each of these four presidents were faced with.